Flight 634 from Boston to Denver was half full on that Tuesday afternoon when Aaron boarded and settled into seat 18D. A quick scan of the cabin showed the usual mix of business travelers, a few families, and scattered individuals traveling alone. Nothing remarkable caught his attention initially. The flight attendants completed their safety demonstration. The plane pushed back, and within 15 minutes they were airborne, climbing through scattered clouds toward cruising altitude. Aaron pulled out his laptop, planning to work on an article during the 3-hour flight. Everything seemed perfectly routine. Dr. Sarah Chen sat in seat 11B, reviewing patient files on her tablet. At 43, she was a cardiologist at Massachusetts General Hospital, heading to a medical conference in Denver. She'd flown thousands of times and barely noticed the takeoff, absorbed in case studies and research papers. Sarah loved her work with an intensity that sometimes worried her family, but she couldn't help it. The human heart, both its miraculous resilience and its vulnerability, fascinated her endlessly. She had no idea that in about 90 minutes, her expertise would be desperately needed in the most unusual circumstances. 3 rows ahead of Aaron, in seat 15C, a young man named Trevor Mason sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the armrests. Trevor was 28 years old, worked in software development, and was flying to Denver for a job interview at a startup company. This opportunity could change his life, advance his career significantly. But Trevor had a secret he'd never told anyone except his immediate family, a secret that was about to become everyone's problem at 37,000 feet. The flight reached cruising altitude smoothly. Flight attendant Jessica Rodriguez began beverage service, moving her cart down the aisle with practiced efficiency. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked Trevor with her professional smile. Trevor looked at her, and Jessica noticed he seemed pale, slightly sweaty despite the cool cabin temperature. "Just water, please," he said, his voice tight. Jessica handed him a bottle of water and moved on, though something about his appearance bothered her. She made a mental note to check on him later. Aaron noticed the young man 3 rows ahead appeared uncomfortable. Not airsick exactly, but tense, rigid, like he was forcing himself to stay still. Aaron had seen panic attacks on planes before, anxious flyers who spiraled during turbulence or claustrophobic moments. This seemed different somehow. The man wasn't moving, wasn't fidgeting, wasn't exhibiting the typical nervous behaviors. He was doing the opposite, holding himself unnaturally still, as if movement itself was dangerous. Aaron's curiosity piqued, but he returned his attention to his laptop. But wait, here's what nobody knew yet. Trevor Mason was type 1 diabetic, had been since childhood. He managed his condition carefully with insulin injections, continuous glucose monitoring, and strict attention to diet. Normally, he had everything under control. But this morning had been chaotic. His alarm hadn't gone off. He'd overslept, rushed to the airport without breakfast, and in his panic to catch his flight, he'd forgotten to pack his emergency glucose tablets. He'd managed to get through security and boarding, but now, 90 minutes into the flight, his blood sugar was dropping dangerously low. Trevor felt the familiar warning signs. Lightheadedness, slight tremor in his hands, the beginning of confusion that meant his brain wasn't getting enough glucose to function properly. He checked his continuous glucose monitor on his phone discreetly. 58 milligrams per deciliter, and dropping. Normal was above 70. Below 54 was considered severely low, a medical emergency. He needed sugar immediately. Fast-acting carbohydrates. But he had nothing. He'd eaten all his in-flight snacks, and they'd barely made a dent in the problem. Trevor pressed his call button. Jessica responded quickly. "Yes, sir. How can I help?" Trevor's speech was slightly slurred now, a symptom of the dropping blood sugar affecting his brain function. "I'm diabetic. Blood sugar dropping. Need something sugary. Fast, please." Jessica's training kicked in immediately. "Of course, give me just a moment." She hurried to the galley, returning with orange juice and packets of sugar. "Here, drink this quickly." Trevor downed the orange juice and tore open sugar packets, pouring them directly into his mouth. But his blood sugar had dropped too far, too fast. The orange juice and sugar would help eventually, but his body needed more than that now. Trevor's hands began shaking visibly. Sweat poured down his face. His vision started to blur. Jessica saw his condition deteriorating and made a quick decision. She grabbed the intercom. "If there is a doctor on board, please identify yourself immediately. We have a medical emergency." Her voice was calm but urgent. Dr. Sarah Chen's head snapped up from her tablet. "Medical emergency." She unbuckled immediately and raised her hand. "I'm a doctor. Cardiology." Jessica spotted her and waved her forward. Sarah moved quickly to row 15, where Trevor was now visibly in distress. She knelt in the aisle beside him, immediately taking his pulse. It was rapid, thready. "Sir, I'm Dr. Chen. Can you tell me what's happening?" Trevor struggled to focus on her face. "Diabetic, hypoglycemia, blood sugar, dropping." Sarah understood instantly. She'd treated diabetic emergencies in the ER early in her career. "How low is your blood sugar?" Trevor fumbled with his phone, showing her the glucose monitor reading. 41 milligrams per deciliter. Sarah's expression tightened. That was dangerously low. At this level, Trevor could lose consciousness, have seizures, or worse. What have you had to eat or drink? Trevor tried to respond, but his words weren't making sense anymore, the slurred speech worsening. Sarah turned to Jessica. We need more sugar, fast. Do you have honey packets? Glucose gel? Anything with concentrated sugar? Jessica rushed to gather supplies while Sarah monitored Trevor's pulse and respiration. Aaron, along with other nearby passengers, watched with growing concern. Trevor's eyes were starting to roll back. He was losing consciousness. Sarah acted quickly, tilting his head to ensure his airway stayed open. Sir, stay with me. Trevor, stay awake. Can you hear me? Trevor mumbled incoherently. His body was shutting down as his brain starved for glucose. Jessica returned with everything she could find. Honey packets, maple syrup from the breakfast service, jelly beans from the first-class snack baskets, regular soda. Sarah ripped open honey packets and squeezed the contents into Trevor's mouth, massaging his jaw to help him swallow. Come on, swallow. You need to swallow this. Trevor's swallow reflex was weak but still functioning. Sarah got 3 honey packets into him, then had him sip regular Coca-Cola. Small sips. Just keep drinking. Now here's where it got critical. Despite the sugar intake, Trevor's condition continued to decline. He was barely conscious, his responses to Sarah's questions becoming non-existent. Sarah checked his glucose monitor again. 39. Still dropping. The sugar she'd given him hadn't kicked in yet, or it wasn't enough. She made a rapid assessment. Trevor needed intravenous glucose, or he needed glucagon, a hormone injection that would trigger his liver to release stored glucose. Did they have either on this plane? What's in the medical kit? Sarah asked Jessica urgently. Jessica grabbed the aircraft's emergency medical kit and opened it. Sarah rifled through the contents. Standard supplies, bandages, basic medications, a blood pressure cuff, but no IV glucose solution, no glucagon injector. Commercial aircraft weren't typically equipped with medications for specific conditions like diabetes. Sarah's mind raced. Without glucagon or IV glucose, Trevor's brain could suffer permanent damage. She needed another solution fast. You won't believe what Sarah did next. She turned to the passengers. Does anyone have a glucagon emergency kit? If you're diabetic and carry glucagon, I need it now. A moment of silence. Then from the back of the plane, a woman's voice called out. I have one. My daughter's diabetic. A woman in her 50s rushed forward, digging through her purse. She produced a small red case marked with medical symbols. Sarah opened it. Glucagon emergency injection kit. Thank God. Sarah had administered glucagon exactly twice in her career, both times in emergency room settings over a decade ago. But the training came back. She pulled out the vial of powdered glucagon and the syringe of diluting fluid. Her hands moved with practiced precision despite the stress. Mix the powder and liquid. Draw up the solution. Prepare the injection site. Trevor was now completely unresponsive, slumped in his seat. Sarah exposed his shoulder and injected the glucagon into his deltoid muscle. How long until it works? Jessica asked, her voice tight with worry. Sarah checked her watch. 5 to 15 minutes, typically. It triggers the liver to release stored glucose into his bloodstream. We should see him regain consciousness soon if it works. The unspoken concern hung in the air. If it works. If Trevor's liver had enough stored glucose. If permanent brain damage hadn't already occurred. They waited. Every second felt like an hour. Aaron watched this drama unfold, his heart pounding. The young man looked like he might be dying right there in seat 15C. Other passengers were silent, some praying, all watching with horrified fascination. The mother who'd provided the glucagon kit stood nearby, tears streaming down her face. Please work, she whispered. Please let him be okay. Sarah kept her fingers on Trevor's pulse, monitoring, waiting, hoping. 3 minutes passed. 4 minutes. Then Trevor's eyelids fluttered. Sarah leaned close. Trevor, can you hear me? A groan. His head moved slightly. 5 minutes. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then gradually clearing. What happened? His voice was weak but intelligible. Relief flooded through Sarah. You had severe hypoglycemia. Your blood sugar dropped dangerously low. I gave you glucagon. How do you feel? Trevor blinked, trying to orient himself. Confused, shaky, weak. Sarah nodded. That's normal. After a hypoglycemic episode, we need to keep getting sugar into you. Can you drink more juice? Jessica handed Trevor another bottle of orange juice. He drank slowly, his hands still trembling. Sarah checked his glucose monitor. 62. Rising. The glucagon was working. Trevor was out of immediate danger. The entire cabin seemed to exhale collectively, but Sarah wasn't done. She spent the next 30 minutes monitoring Trevor carefully, ensuring his blood sugar stabilized and stayed stable. She asked detailed questions about his diabetes management, his typical glucose control, what had led to this crisis. Trevor explained about the rushed morning, the forgotten glucose tablets, the inadequate breakfast. "I'm usually so careful," he said, clearly embarrassed. "I don't know how I let this happen." Sarah's expression was kind but firm. Diabetes is unforgiving. One mistake can be catastrophic, especially when you're traveling. You need to build redundancy into your emergency supplies. Multiple glucose sources, in multiple bags, always. And you need to wear a medical alert bracelet. If you'd lost consciousness before telling someone you were diabetic, we might not have figured it out in time. Trevor nodded, chastened. "You're right. I'll do better. Thank you, Dr. Chen. You saved my life." The mother who'd provided the glucagon kit approached once Sarah had finished her examination. "Thank you for knowing what to do," she said to Sarah. "My daughter is 12, type 1 diabetic since she was 6. I carry that kit everywhere, terrified of this exact scenario. I never thought I'd actually need to give it to someone else." Sarah took the woman's hand. "Your preparation saved this young man's life today. Thank you for being ready." Captain David Morrison had been notified of the medical emergency shortly after it began. He'd been monitoring the situation from the cockpit, ready to divert to the nearest airport if necessary. Once Jessica confirmed the passenger was stable, David made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I want to thank Dr. Chen and the passenger who provided emergency medication for their quick action in handling a medical situation. The passenger is now stable, and we will continue to Denver as planned. These are the moments that remind us we're all in this together. Thank you to everyone for your patience and cooperation." Spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin. Passengers clapped for Sarah, for the mother with the glucagon, for Jessica's quick response, for Trevor's survival. Sarah felt her cheeks flush. She'd just been doing what any doctor would do, what she was trained to do. But she understood the passengers needed this moment, needed to celebrate the fact that death had been close and had been turned away, that someone among them had known what to do and had done it, that tragedy had been averted. Aaron approached Sarah after she returned to her seat. "I'm a writer," he explained. "I document stories of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Would you be willing to talk to me about what happened?" Sarah considered, then nodded. "But tell Trevor's story too. He's the one who lived through it. And tell the story of that mother who carried medicine for a daughter who wasn't even on the plane. Those are the real stories." The rest of the flight passed quietly. Trevor remained in his seat, monitored periodically by Sarah, drinking juice and eating snacks that passengers around him offered. His blood sugar gradually normalized to safer levels. He'd need to see his endocrinologist as soon as possible, adjust his management strategies, ensure this never happened again. But he was alive, he was conscious, he would walk off this plane and continue his life. That was everything. When the plane landed in Denver, paramedics boarded to evaluate Trevor. Sarah provided them with detailed notes about his blood sugar levels, the timing of the glucagon administration, his current condition. The paramedics praised her intervention. "You did everything right, doctor. Textbook management of severe hypoglycemia. This patient is lucky you were on board." They transported Trevor to a nearby hospital for observation and further treatment, standard protocol after a severe diabetic emergency. But this is where the story takes another turn. 2 days later, Aaron received a call from Trevor Mason. "Dr. Chen gave me your number. I wanted to thank you for telling my story, but also to tell you what happened after. The hospital ran comprehensive tests. They discovered I have an insulinoma, a rare pancreatic tumor that produces excess insulin. That's why my blood sugar dropped so catastrophically, despite my usual careful management. The tumor was causing random insulin surges I couldn't predict or control." Aaron's breath caught. "That's serious. What now?" Trevor's voice was surprisingly upbeat. "Surgery next week to remove the tumor. The doctors say it's almost certainly benign, and once it's out, my glucose control should actually improve significantly. But here's the thing, if I hadn't had that hypoglycemic crisis on the plane, if Dr. Chen hadn't been there, I might have had an even worse episode later, maybe while driving or alone somewhere. This emergency probably saved my life by leading to the diagnosis." Aaron felt chills. The interconnected nature of events, the way crisis could lead to revelation, the way disaster averted could prevent future disaster, it was profound. He immediately called Dr. Sarah Chen to share this development. Sarah was silent for a long moment when Aaron told her about the insulinoma. Then she spoke quietly. "That explains why the glucagon worked so well. With an insulinoma producing excess insulin, the glucagon counteracted it perfectly. If he'd been a typical type 1 diabetic without the tumor, we might have needed more intervention. In a strange way, the tumor made him easier to treat in that moment." Sarah and Trevor met in person a week after his successful surgery. The tumor had been removed laparoscopically, and pathology confirmed it was benign. Trevor was recovering well and learning to manage his diabetes without the complicating factor of random insulin surges. "You gave me my life back twice," Trevor told Sarah over coffee, "once on that plane, and once by helping discover the tumor. I don't know how to thank you adequately." Sarah smiled. "You thank me by taking care of yourself, by being prepared, By wearing that medical alert bracelet we talked about. By telling your story so other diabetics understand the importance of emergency planning. Trevor nodded earnestly. I'm giving talks at diabetes support groups about what happened, warning people about complacency, showing them that even experienced diabetics can have emergencies. It's been meaningful, turning my crisis into education for others. The mother who'd provided the glucagon kit, whose name was Margaret Foster, stayed in touch with both Sarah and Trevor. Her daughter Emily was inspired by the story. My mom saved someone's life with the medicine she carries for me, Emily told her diabetes support group. It made me feel like my diabetes isn't just a burden. The things we need to survive can help save others too. That's kind of amazing. Aaron wrote extensively about the incident, focusing on the layers of preparation and providence that had prevented tragedy. Sarah's medical expertise, Margaret's foresight in carrying emergency medication, Jessica's quick recognition of the crisis, the airline's decision to carry emergency medical kits, Trevor's own action in alerting the crew before losing consciousness. All these elements had aligned perfectly. Remove any single one, and Trevor might have died or suffered permanent brain damage. The article resonated deeply with readers, particularly those in the diabetes community. Advocacy organizations used it in their education materials. Airlines reviewed their medical kit contents, with some adding glucagon to their emergency supplies after reading Trevor's story. The Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation invited Sarah, Trevor, and Margaret to speak at their annual conference. Their presentation on diabetic emergencies during travel was standing room only. But here's what impacted Aaron most when interviewing everyone involved. Each person felt they'd simply done what anyone would do. Sarah, I'm a doctor. I was trained for this. Margaret, I carry glucagon everywhere. Of course I'd share it in an emergency. Jessica, flight attendants are first responders. This is literally our job. Trevor, I told them I was diabetic as soon as I recognized the problem. Anyone would do that. Yet their individual anyone would do this actions combined had saved a life. That's what Aaron wanted readers to understand. Heroism often looks like people doing their jobs well, being prepared, acting quickly when crisis hits. Not dramatic gestures or superhuman feats, but competence and compassion applied at the crucial moment. Sarah hadn't performed experimental surgery in the aisle. She'd recognized a medical emergency, used available resources, and applied appropriate treatment. That's what heroes actually do. 6 months after the incident, Trevor got the job he'd been interviewing for when the emergency occurred. The startup had heard about his story and was impressed by his resilience. You handled a life-threatening crisis with presence of mind to alert the crew, the hiring manager told him. That's exactly the kind of clear thinking under pressure we value. Trevor thrived in the new role, and he made sure every colleague knew his story and understood the importance of medical preparedness. Sarah returned to her cardiology practice with renewed appreciation for her skills and training. I've performed hundreds of cardiac catheterizations, managed countless heart failure patients, made life or death decisions routinely, she told Aaron in a follow-up interview. But something about that moment on the plane, using basic emergency medicine to save someone's life, reminded me why I became a doctor. Not for the cutting-edge procedures or the complex cases, but for the fundamental mission, saving lives when it matters most. Margaret Foster and her daughter Emily started a nonprofit organization focused on diabetes education and emergency preparedness. They distributed free glucagon kits to people who couldn't afford them, taught diabetes management classes, and advocated for better awareness of diabetic emergencies. Trevor's crisis became Emily's purpose, Margaret explained to Aaron. She saw that the challenges she faces with diabetes could be turned into help for others. That transformed how she views her condition. The airline that operated Flight 634 used the incident in their crew training videos. Jessica Rodriguez was featured explaining her response, the importance of immediate action, the protocol for medical emergencies. The key is not to panic, Jessica told trainees. Trust your training, call for help when you need it, and remember that passengers themselves can be resources. That mother with glucagon, Dr. Chen with her expertise, they were assets we could deploy. Never forget that the people in the cabin might have exactly what you need. Aaron included Trevor's story in his ongoing series about crisis, response, and the interconnected nature of how disasters are averted. We focus on dramatic rescues, he wrote, but most lives are saved quietly, by people doing ordinary things extraordinarily well. A doctor kneeling in an aisle, a mother carrying medicine, a flight attendant grabbing the intercom without hesitation, a young man staying conscious long enough to say, "I'm diabetic." These small actions, perfectly executed, perfectly timed, create survival. That's the real miracle. 3 years after the incident, Sarah, Trevor, Margaret, and Emily gathered for a reunion dinner in Denver. They'd stayed in touch, forming an unlikely family bound by crisis survived. Trevor brought photos of his wedding, Emily brought her straight-A report card, Margaret brought news of their nonprofit's expansion, Sarah brought stories from her practice. They laughed, remembered, celebrated how far they'd all come. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Trevor began? But Sarah cut him off gently. No, that way lies madness. We can't know alternate timelines. We only know what did happen. You're here, you're healthy. A tumor was found and removed. These are facts. Everything else is speculation. Trevor nodded, but pressed on. Still, I think about it. If you hadn't been on that flight, if Margaret hadn't brought glucagon, if Jessica hadn't acted so quickly, any one thing different, and I'm dead or brain damaged. Margaret raised her glass. Then here's to the universe. Fate, providence, whatever you want to call it. Here's to being on the right flight at the right time with the right people. Here's to preparation meeting crisis. Here's to all of us, doing what we could with what we had, and somehow it was enough. They toasted, clinked glasses, felt the weight and gift of that truth. Sometimes, everything aligns perfectly. Sometimes, competence and preparation and quick thinking combine to defeat death. Sometimes, the good guys win. Emily, now 15 and managing her diabetes with the wisdom of someone who'd seen what could go wrong, spoke quietly. When I was diagnosed at 6, I thought my life was over. I thought diabetes would define me, limit me, make me less, but now I see it differently. Mom carries glucagon because of me, and that saved Trevor. I understand crisis management, preparedness, bodily awareness in ways my friends don't. Diabetes hasn't limited me, it's given me knowledge and perspective. I'm grateful for that. Aaron listened to Emily's words and felt something shift in his understanding. He'd been framing Trevor's story as a near-miss disaster, a crisis averted, but maybe it was something else. Maybe it was about how challenges equip us to help others. Emily's diabetes meant Margaret carried glucagon. Margaret's preparedness saved Trevor. Trevor's crisis led to discovering his tumor. The tumor's removal improved his life significantly. Each difficulty had somehow generated blessing downstream. That's what I want people to understand, Aaron said, speaking slowly as the thought formed. We tend to see challenges as pure negative. Emily's diabetes, Trevor's hypoglycemic crisis, the tumor. But each of those difficulties created knowledge, preparation, diagnosis, connection. I'm not saying challenges are good, but maybe they're not purely bad either. Maybe they're just reality, and what matters is how we respond to them. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. In medicine, we see this constantly. The patient whose heart attack at 40 leads to lifestyle changes that add decades to their life. The person whose cancer scare results in early detection of something else. Pain and difficulty wake us up, make us pay attention, force us to act. Trevor, you literally might not have discovered that tumor for years without the dramatic hypoglycemia. By the time you did, it might have been much worse. Trevor had tears in his eyes. I've never thought about it that way. I've been viewing that day on the plane as this terrible, embarrassing crisis that I barely survived. But you're right, it probably saved me from something much worse later. It led to finding the tumor early. It connected me to all of you. It gave me a story that's helped educate hundreds of other diabetics. Maybe it wasn't a disaster. Maybe it was a disguised gift. The conversation continued late into the evening, touching on themes of resilience, preparation, connection, the strange alchemy of crisis that transforms into blessing when met with competence and compassion. By the time they parted ways, each person felt they understood their own role in the story differently. Not as heroes exactly, but as participants in something larger. A web of human connection that catches people when they fall. Aaron's final article about Trevor's story, published 5 years after the incident, was titled "The Web That Catches Us." It explored how individual preparation and expertise, when activated by crisis, creates a safety net that prevents tragedy. We are not alone, Aaron wrote. Even 37,000 feet above the earth, surrounded by strangers, we are not alone. Because someone's daughter has diabetes, medication is available. Because someone chose cardiology, expertise is present. Because someone trains flight attendants well, help is summoned. Because someone stays conscious long enough to communicate their need, diagnosis is possible. We catch each other. That's what civilization is. A web of mutual aid, stretched across space and time, ready to catch whoever falls. Trevor Mason, now 33, married to a wonderful woman he met at a diabetes advocacy event, working successfully in his tech career, living without the insulin-producing tumor that had nearly killed him, read Aaron's article with tears streaming down his face. He thought about that day on the plane, the moment he'd realized his blood sugar was dropping and he had no way to stop it. The terror, the certainty he might die. And then the miracle of help arriving, of competence surrounding him, of survival snatched from disaster. He wrote to Aaron, "Thank you for telling my story right, for understanding that it's not about me being special or brave. I was just a guy who made mistakes and got incredibly lucky that the right people were in the right place. That's the story, that we need each other, that preparation matters, that expertise matters, that paying attention matters, that we're all in this together, whether we acknowledge it or not. Flight 634 taught me that. I'm grateful for the lesson, even though I'd rather not have learned it quite so dramatically. Dr. Sarah Chen, now 48, still practicing cardiology with the same passion she'd always had, kept a small souvenir from that day on her office desk. The empty glucagon emergency kit that Margaret had provided. Margaret had given it to her as a memento at one of their gatherings. Sarah looked at it often, especially on difficult days when her work felt overwhelming. It reminded her that medicine wasn't just about high-tech procedures and complex interventions. Sometimes it was as simple as recognizing an emergency and having the right tool at the right time. Margaret Foster and her daughter Emily, who was now applying to colleges with plans to study medicine and diabetes research, had turned their crisis into purpose. Their nonprofit had distributed over 3,000 free glucagon kits and educated tens of thousands of people about diabetic emergency preparedness. Trevor's story is our mission statement, Margaret told donors. It shows why this work matters, why being prepared matters, why education matters. One kit, carried by one person, saved a life. Imagine what thousands of kits could do. The interconnected web of human aid that had caught Trevor on Flight 634 had expanded exponentially. Every person educated by Margaret and Emily's organization was now part of that web. Every pilot and flight attendant who watched the training video featuring Jessica Rodriguez learned to respond better to medical emergencies. Every diabetic who heard Trevor speak understood the importance of redundant preparation. The ripples from that one near disaster spread far and wide. 10 years after the incident, Aaron organized a reunion of everyone involved. Trevor, Sarah, Margaret, Emily, Jessica, even Captain Morrison and some of the passengers who'd witnessed the emergency. They gathered in Denver, at the airport where it had all happened, and shared updates on their lives. The gathering felt less like commemorating a crisis and more like celebrating a family reunion, because that's what they'd become, forged by fire at 37,000 feet. Here's what I've learned, Trevor said during dinner, standing to address the group. We think we're independent, self-sufficient, masters of our own fate. But we're not. We're interdependent. I'm alive because Dr. Chen went to medical school, because Margaret packed glucagon for Emily, because Jessica called for help, because all of you created a safety net I didn't even know I needed until I was falling into it. That's humbling, and it's beautiful. We catch each other. That's what love looks like at scale. Sarah added her reflection. Medicine trains us to be competent, knowledgeable, prepared. But that day on the plane taught me something they don't teach in medical school. That competence in community is exponentially more powerful than competence alone. I had knowledge, but I needed Margaret's glucagon. I had training, but I needed Jessica's quick action. I had expertise, but I needed Trevor's courage to speak up before he lost consciousness. None of us could have saved Trevor alone. Together, it was almost easy. Margaret spoke next, her voice thick with emotion. Emily's diabetes was the hardest thing our family ever faced. Years of worry, vigilance, fear every time her blood sugar dropped or spiked. But that challenge made us prepared, and that preparation saved Trevor. I can't say I'm grateful for Emily's diabetes, but I'm grateful that something good came from it, that our pain equipped us to prevent someone else's tragedy. That gives meaning to the struggle. Emily, now a confident young woman planning to become an endocrinologist, had the final word. I used to hate my diabetes. It made me different, vulnerable, dependent on medication to survive. But Trevor's story helped me see it differently. My challenges gave my family knowledge that saved a life. My disease created awareness that's helped thousands through our nonprofit. I'm not glad I'm diabetic, but I'm glad that being diabetic meant I could contribute to something meaningful. That's enough. Aaron recorded these reflections, knowing they contained the essence of what he'd been trying to articulate for years. That we are not alone. That our challenges equip us to help others. That competence, preparation, and compassion, when combined with crisis, create miracles. That the web of human connection catches us when we fall. That ordinary people doing their jobs well, being prepared, acting quickly, caring enough to help, that's where real power lives. Flight 634, Boston to Denver, continued its regular schedule. Different passengers, different crew, but the same route. And occasionally, someone would board who knew the story. A diabetic carrying redundant glucose supplies because they'd heard Trevor's presentation. A medical professional who'd read Sarah's case study in a journal. A parent who'd attended Margaret and Emily's preparedness seminar. The legacy of that near disaster spread invisibly through the people it touched, making the world incrementally safer, more prepared, more connected. That's justice, Aaron realized. Not punishment for wrongdoing, though that has its place, but the deeper justice of competence meeting crisis, of preparation preventing tragedy, of connection creating safety. Trevor had faced death at 37,000 feet, and an invisible web of human aid had caught him. That web exists everywhere, stretched across society, maintained by people who choose competence over mediocrity, preparation over complacency, action over passivity. That's the web we all contribute to, whether we know it or not. And sometimes on a Tuesday afternoon flight from Boston to Denver, that web becomes visible. A doctor kneels beside a stranger, a mother shares her daughter's medicine, a flight attendant summons help without hesitation, a young man stays conscious long enough to name his emergency, and death, which seemed certain, is turned away. The web holds, the person is caught, life continues. That's not luck, that's humanity at its best. That's all of us, catching each other, one crisis at a time,